You're clean, aren't you? Except for your tower. You're a tower junkie, Roland.
Hello and welcome to Tower Junkies, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. Tower Junkies is a podcast devoted to Stephen King and his magnum opus, the Dark Tower series. We discuss the themes, characters, and mythology of the series in Palaver episodes, and review the books and comic series in Kef episodes. We also discuss King novels related to the Dark Tower, non-Tower King novels, TV and film adaptations of King's work, and the latest news about potential Dark Tower-related adaptations. You can find more of our work at TowerJunkiesPod.com and follow us on every level of social media at TowerJunkiesPod. This episode, this week, is what's called a Maerlyn's Grapefruit episode, which I'm not 100% married to that categorization, but I'm going to roll with it. Maerlyn's Grapefruit episodes are essentially our review episodes of non-Tower related Stephen King novels. In this edition of Maerlyn's Grapefruit, we're going to be discussing Gerald's Game by Stephen King, of course. I'll get into my review here in a second. For now, it's just me. My name is Matt Hurt, if this is your first time listening. Tower Junkies is the third podcast from ObsessiveViewer.com. We also have Obsessive Viewer, which is a weekly movie and TV podcast, and Anthology, which is a solo podcast that I host with me going through the Twilight Zone as a first-time viewer, as well as having some bonus episodes for modern and overall contemporary science fiction anthology shows. You can find more information about the podcast at obsessiveviewer.com/podcasts. So in this edition of Tower Junkies, this is actually the first book review episode that I've done, that I've recorded for this podcast specifically, and recorded for any podcast that I do. So bear with me if I'm a little bit out of my depth here, because this is kind of new for me. So it's just me this week, and next week we're going to have a review of Gerald's Game, the film adaptation that is going to be premiering on Netflix. That by the time you're listening to this may have already premiered on Netflix, now that I think about it. But anyway, that is going to come later. So I read the book in preparation for the movie. I actually listened to it on Audible. We don't have a sponsorship with Audible or anything, but I am such a huge fan of Audible. I recently got into it about nine months ago, I think. And it's life-changing for me, because I am a pretty notoriously slow reader of physical books. Even though I love reading and I love reading physical books, I'm still pretty slow at it. But I like having audiobooks where I can kind of still devote my attention to it, but do kind of work around my apartment or just do things or commuting places and driving places. I just love that, having that free time, or having that time to listen to a book. So anyway, the narrator for Gerald's Game was Lindsay Krause, and I thought she did a really fine job. Her voice kind of got a little annoying when she switched over to some of the voices of Jesse Burlingame's inner monologue. That's just minor nitpicks on my part. One thing that I really didn't like about the performance or the editing of it, and this is something that I believe is also prevalent in the Insomnia audiobook, but there was music played throughout it, and like there are these little musical interludes between separate sections of the book. Like it's probably 4 or 5 times every hour, and it's a rotating type of music that just sounds like just basic, like preset musical cues that you would find in GarageBand. And they happen frequently each hour of I believe it was a 12-hour book. And it just got on my nerves so much. It was so distracting, and I really hated it. So that's my gripe about that. But the way that these Maerlyn's Grapefruit book review episodes are going to go is I'm going to read essentially the plot description, courtesy of the back of the paperback book, and I'm going to read that, and then I'll go into kind of a spoiler-free thoughts on the book, and then I'll have a spoiler discussion separate to that. So if you haven't read the book, feel free to hear my analysis of it or my thoughts on it without being spoiled, and then come back after you've read or listened to it to hear my spoiler thoughts. Timestamps for the spoiler review and different reviews and everything can be found in the show notes of this episode. Let's get to it. So the plot description, courtesy of the back of the paperback, which, by the way, they have Simon & Schuster, or I guess Gallery Books. It might be a division of Simon & Schuster. I'm not sure. I haven't researched it or anything. But they have been re-releasing... Yeah, it's Gallery Books. They have been re-releasing King's novels in these paperback editions that are very colorful and uniform. They're just beautiful to look at. They're so simplistic that it's just a base color in the background with Stephen King's name in, like in Gerald's Game, for instance, it's Stephen King's name in black typeface. That's like it's like a marker. That's the font is like a Sharpie's. It was written in Sharpie, and then the title in white, and then there's just a colorful blue depiction of handcuffs on it, and it's just so simplistic. And I've been buying up the paperbacks because they look really nice on my bookcase. So anyway, plot description for Gerald's Game, and here it is. Once again, Jessie Burlingame has been talked into submitting to her husband Gerald's kinky sex games, something that she's frankly had enough of, and they never held much charm for her to begin with. So much for a romantic getaway at their secluded summer home. After Jessie is handcuffed to the bedposts and Gerald crosses a line with his wife, the day ends with deadly consequences. Now, Jessie is utterly trapped in an isolated lakeside house that has become her prison and comes face to face with her deepest, darkest fears and memories. Her only company is that of the various voices filling her mind, as well as the shadows of nightfall that may conceal either an imagined or very real threat right there with her. So, this was one of my blind spots for my overall goal to read every Stephen King book there is. It was one of my blind spots, and I just knew very little about it going in, except that it was about a woman confined to a bed by handcuffs after her husband dies during a sex act. So that was all I knew about the book, and I was really intrigued because Stephen King, he has these different levels to his novels, that some of them are big, encompassing, like huge things like the Dark Tower series or It or Under the Dome, or these books that basically have a living and breathing city and ecosystem in them, that's so involved and just massive. But then he has these very small, more personal, smaller scale books that are very much about like pretty much a straightforward kind of premise. Like, this is a pretty straightforward premise, but it's also incredibly terrifying in terms of a situation, and it seems real. Like, you wouldn't think about this. Like, you're putting yourself in a position, and like the way that it all unfolds in here is that it's just kind of an accident. Like, I mean, it's the way it's all set up is there's a lot of moving pieces to it, but I mean, Gerald just dies right there, and she can't, like, she's trapped. And it's one of the great things about the way that King develops this in this book is that he starts it off with, like, he doesn't waste time developing the setting or anything, because everything that he describes in the setting and everything that he describes in those opening pages are all things that come together to really hammer home the predicament that Jessie finds herself in. And that's something I really appreciated. And as the book goes on, you get a real sense for just how dire the situation is, but it isn't solely about her confinement to the bed. It's more about her mental state and the psychological torture that is both being subjected onto her and is being brought up from the recesses of her memory, and you get a real sense for, you get a very clear idea of some of the most painful moments of her life and how they interact or how they influence other situations. And she rationalizes it with, she rationalizes things in her past with why they, how they led to her being in this predicament that could very well spell the end of her life. And it's a really well told story that I really enjoyed, quite a bit. It goes to some places that I wasn't expecting it to, but it still was pretty enjoyable. It was a very good psychological thriller from Stephen King, and you would think that there's always a risk of having not enough to say in this type of story. Like, you have the basic premise of a woman that's handcuffed to a bed and trapped there. You run the risk of running out of things to say, and King doesn't really do that here, because it's very much, like I said, steeped in her history and what the character has gone through in her life, and that really elevates not only the tension of the entire story, but the freshness of the story as it unfolds. And it goes into places that I'll talk about in more detail in my spoiler section, but that I'm kind of conflicted by, but just the basic idea of it, the basic structure of the book really worked for me, because that's something that you would be in, like in that situation, you would be more self-reflective, and you would learn a lot about yourself and about your willingness to survive and what you're willing to do, and how you can get past this ordeal. And that's something that's really handled well within the pages of Gerald's Game. And I'm trying to think of what else I can say without spoiling it. Like I said, this is the first real book review that I've done in podcast form, so it's kind of a learning. There's a bit of a learning curve with me here, and being the only one on this episode is a little intimidating too, but we'll work through it. But overall, Gerald's Game was a pretty satisfying psychological thriller with a lot of really interesting and frightening moments spread throughout it. And it went into some places that I was not expecting it to go, which is always a pleasant thing when I'm reading King. That the premise alone is so simplistic and so straightforward, and he spends so much time in the opening pages just explaining why, like laying the groundwork for things to come within the narrative. But it's so straightforward, but it is such a terrifying premise, because you get this claustrophobic feeling, or this helpless feeling that if you empathize with the character, you just feel just as helpless as she does. And it's a terrifying ordeal to think about, like, what the way that it's set up. It's very clear that she is the only way she's going to get out of this is if she gets herself out of it. And the way that it's set up, like, King doesn't do her any favors in the setup of it. It's not an easy fix, and I mean, who's to say if she even gets out? That's what I'll say in my non-spoiler section. So I guess that'll do it for the non-spoiler part of this review. So if you haven't read Gerald's Game yet, feel free to leave the podcast and come back to it when you have read it, because I'm going to get into my more in-depth, spoiler-filled review of Gerald's Game.
Hey everyone, I'm Christopher DeFilippis.
My name is Skipper Martin.
And you might know us as the hosts of 112263, an event podcast. But Skipper and I are here to announce our new podcast, which will be all about the new Hulu series, Castle Rock. Not only are we going to be covering the TV show, but we're going to be covering the Stephen King books and characters that seem to be somehow tied into the TV show.
Not to mention TV movies and other theatrical movies, even the bad ones. Ugh. But we're going to do it. We're going to do it, right, Chris?
Yep, we're going to do it all. So watch this space, subscribe, and we will be dropping our first episode in no time. It's about a certain murderous clown.
Can't wait.
Follow the Castle Rock TV podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at CRTVPod. Visit our website at crtvpodcast.com and support us on Patreon at patreon.com/CRTVPod. The Castle Rock TV podcast is a Fractured Entertainment to Flipside Media production.
All right, so spoilers on for Gerald's game. So a big part of this novel is how Jessie Burlingame, how she deals with her situation. She has these inner monologues with these different voices that basically one's like the hard-nosed voice of her former roommate, and the other one is this kind of goody two-shoes one that's more fearful and everything. And it's a really interesting dynamic. I really like the use of the inner monologue and the other voices for two reasons. One, they help establish the setting and establish the inner. It's not just her thinking about it; it's her having a conversation with other characters. And I thought that was really, really well done. And it also helps. It also helps us bring. It also helps bring us to pivotal moments in the history of the character, and really helps us helps establish what the character's strengths are and what she needs to overcome to get out of this situation. And the kind of immediate thing that I really got uneasy about or unnerved by was the thought of the dog eating Gerald. It's such a gruesome and wonderful thing, and it's the way that King sets all of this up. It's like he establishes that the back door keeps flying open, and that Gerald didn't close it properly, and then he establishes that there's a dog there, and then as soon as Gerald dies and he's on the floor, I'm just thinking like that dog is going to come eat him, and like just the thought of it is so gross and grotesque and unnerving that I'm almost disappointed that we didn't get, like, there's some graphic depictions of the dog eating Gerald and tearing away at Gerald. It's very graphic, but I kind of wish that it's morbid, but I kind of wish that there was a little more. Like, I kind of wish that he went into more detail about, like, maybe the smell affecting Jessie and more detail about that. I mean, we get a lot of grotesque descriptions of it, like the dog tearing away at the cheek and tearing away at the flesh and everything, and then just the flies that are swirling around Gerald. So it's not like, I don't know, probably in a less psychological book, in a more cheap scare kind of book, it would be more pivotal to show Gerald's decomposition, while to have that affect Jessie's mental state and everything. But the way that it's handled, I have no real complaints for it. It's just, in my own morbid way, I was kind of expecting there to be a little bit more. And we get a lot of hints at what happened at Dark Score Lake, and before it was revealed that she was the victim of a molestation from her father. Before that, I kind of wondered if we were going to get a more supernatural thing, because obviously Stephen King is known for having supernatural elements in his stories, kind of pitting ordinary characters and everyday characters into abnormal and supernatural situations. But what was refreshing was that this didn't have like that supernatural element to it. It had a little bit, but it was more psychological on Jessie's part, and I'll talk more about that here in a bit. But I was kind of wondering if we were going to get into a supernatural kind of story about the Merchant of Death or whatever. I was wondering if the Space Cowboy was like a supernatural entity. But I'm really happy with what we got with what we got instead. Like, I kind of wondered when he first introduced the Dark Score Lake memory, I kind of wondered if the eclipse like caused her to have, like, that's why she has voices in her head or something to that effect. But it turned out that she was just molested, which is terrible and disturbing in its own right, and really gives a lot of intrigue and dimension to that character. And in terms of how it's revealed, we get a quick memory of Jesse's back. I think this was in 1975 or 1965, so 2 years after Dark Score Lake, I believe. So I didn't have it in my notes here, but there's a memory of her brother goosing her or just playfully just messing with her, and her overreacting and freaking out and almost like beating him because of it. And at first you get this kind of weird, when it's first introduced, before you know that she was molested, you get this kind of like, that's kind of a weird thing. Maybe she has, I was thinking maybe she has like an anger issue, or this is when I was still thinking that maybe it was a supernatural story, that maybe there was something to her that was going to be revealed later. But not only is it made apparent that it's because she was a victim of abuse and sexual abuse and molestation, that not only is it revealed then, like after it's revealed, she actually revisits that memory, and you really get a sense of why she flipped out and she flipped out on her brother. And it's just so unnerving and unsettling, and really puts it into the backlash that she experienced, or the lashing out at her brother. It really puts it into context, and it's really tragic. So the actual memory of Dark Score Lake and the actual abuse that she suffered, it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying, and King really, really lingers on it, and he really goes into depth about it. And it's so, I really don't know how I feel about it. It's really unsettling. And it's meant to be. It's not anything. It's not necessarily gratuitous or anything. It's just really, really unsettling. And it was really hard to get through. Not only the actual moment of it, like the pages and pages and pages of description of it and suspense building toward it and everything, but also like the lead up to it. There was this weird thing between Jessie and her father that maybe this is just how I read it, or this is maybe I'm reading into something that wasn't there. I'm putting too much emphasis on it, but there was this weird connection where it's like, where Jessie felt like inklings of attraction toward her father. Maybe I misheard it when I was listening to the audiobook, but I feel like it was there, and it was kind of weird. And just kind of didn't really work for me. And it kind of seemed a little contradictory, because the whole idea that, well, maybe not contradictory. Maybe I'm over speaking there, because it's not necessarily contradictory, because I was going to say, because it seemed more like, flirtatious. Like, it's such a tricky, it's such a tricky thing to say. It seemed like she was not receptive to it, but like she describes having this weird attraction thing with her father that that part just didn't sit well with me. Maybe I misheard it, but it just felt off. Like the whole lead up to it just felt really off, and I wasn't sure what King was getting at with that. But the actual act, the actual molestation during the eclipse, where he ejaculates on her when she's on his lap, is it's really, really hard to get through. Like it's real, like I said, King lingers on it a lot, and it's really unsettling, really unnerving. And I know that that's the point, but man, I wanted that to get over with very quickly, and King did not give me that luxury. And then he kind of hints at, or he hints at like even worse things happening, saying that, at one point Jessie says, This is around 7 hours into the audiobook, 7 hours and 9 minutes. What he did on the deck was nothing compared to what he did to me in the bedroom, which that made me like cringe really badly. And what that was leading towards is just the manipulation that he did to her. Like he manipulated her into keeping this secret, and just it's despicable and disgusting and just really, really tragic. The way that he talks to his daughter after this event that is going to scar her so deeply, and he gets her to go along with him. The way that it's not like it's such a predatory depiction of the manipulation tactic that he uses. Like it's such a predatory thing where he basically gets her to agree to keep it a secret. And it's just, it's despicable, and it's so unsettling. And it's like, I kind of wish that it was a supernatural thing at Dark Score Lake and not this, because it was too real. It was too, it was really unsettling. So all that being said, we get this introduction of the space cowboy character, which is this figure that visits her in the night, and this is probably the scariest part of the book in terms of just general fear and terror that I felt for her, because she is completely trapped here, and she sees this figure that is obscured in darkness, and she sees that it's very misshapen and seems otherworldly, like alien. And there's this big question of whether or not this is real or imagined, or this is her psyche breaking a little bit. And it's handled really well, because it can be kind of confusing, because he holds the case and has bones and things in it. And it's very confusing, and it's disorienting. And she gets it in her head that he's coming for her, that he is death, and he is going to come for her. And that's what gives her the strength to free herself from the handcuffs. But it's just, when you get to that end game to the last chapter, the last few pages, where she's in the courtroom, and Raymond Joubert, when he looks at her and does those motions to her, the realization that he was really there is unbelievably chilling to me. Like it's really, really unsettling. And what's interesting is that after his visit, and her voices tell her that she is going to have to escape because he's going to come back for her. The actual escape is pretty, I wouldn't say quick, because it's very, very slow and very tense. But after she frees herself, it's like there's a lot of book left. And I was kind of thrown off by that, because I was kind of expecting it, that to be the end of the storyline and everything. But I mean, she escapes with a lot of book left, but the way that she escapes, cutting her wrist, and the description of her trying to slide through, like using the blood to lubricate the handcuff and slide through. There's a description of her peeling her hand, like the act of squeezing out of the handcuff. There's a description of her, it's like she's peeling the skin away from her hand because of it. Like that gave me chills and really was disgusting to me. So I was left wondering how King was gonna resolve the storyline, and how he was going to finish it up with her escaping with like 3 hours left in the audiobook. But I kind of like the way that it was done. There's a bit of a time jump. She's recovering. Well, first of all, she goes through the house, and that was really, really intense also, because she is very much, she's very much in a debilitated state, and she can barely move and function, and she has to essentially escape now. And I really liked the idea that she could have plugged in the phone. She could have called 911 and gotten it, but she had this overwhelming fear that the space cowboy was going to come back and kill her before the police could. So she had to actually force herself to escape. And I really liked that element of it. And the moment where she sees the space cowboy in the rearview mirror in the back of the car, that causes her to crash is really, really unsettling. Like, I listened to that part when I was getting ready for bed one night, and it was just like, that's a mistake. But the time jump to after she's recovered and everything, and kind of getting us caught up with what it is through the letter, or what she's gone through by writing the letter to Ruth, is interesting. There's a lot to catch up on. It's kind of a quick paced thing. And then the whole introduction of Joubert as the potential space cowboy, essentially. I kind of didn't like the way that whole storyline is just introduced. Like, I don't know. I mean, it makes sense. It's effective. It's needed to be sudden, because previous to that, if it was introduced early in the book, we would have spent the whole time reading about the space cowboy thinking, like, I wonder if that's that guy. Or obviously it would be that guy, because why else would King set this up that way? Having it come up at the end suddenly as an explanation for it is kind of a double-edged sword, because it saves us. It makes it about whether or not it was him, rather than confirmation that it was him. Like there is still that suspense of whether or not this creature was real, or if it was this man that was going to kill her, or this man that was visiting her in real life. And the descriptions of Joubert's misdeeds and killings and disgusting behavior are really, really gruesome. Like, I kind of want to read, I don't know what this says about me, especially after I already said that I kind of wish that that King would have went into more detail about the dog eating a human being. But the way that Joubert's crimes are described, I kind of wish that I kind of would like to read like a detective novel with him as the villain. I would like to read that, but that's neither here nor there. But at the end of the day, I did like that the kind of climax of the book 4, or the emotional climax of the book for Jessie, was that she was confronting Joubert to find out if it was him, because at that point he is the physical representation of Jessie's history of abuse. He's a monster through and through, and he terrorized her when she was in her most vulnerable and traumatic state. And I kind of felt like this is my read on it, that with her father and husband both dead, who they both were abusive to her in different ways, with both of them dead at that point, all the blame, the rage, the fear, and the pain kind of shifts on to Joubert. I don't know, like, psychologically, I don't know if that's what King was going for. I don't know if that's psychologically accurate of abuse victims or anything, but I feel like that moment was a triumph for her, being in the courtroom and seeing him, like, getting that confirmation that he wasn't a manifestation of her subconscious, that he was really there, is a big triumphant moment for her, because she is facing her abuser, or the representation of her history of abuse, and she's able to spit in his face and kind of have that closure, and know that she's not crazy, and know that she's not going to have to live in fear of the space cowboy visiting her and following her for the rest of her life until she's killed by it. I just really like that that's how the book ends with in that scenario. I'm really happy with the way that situation resolves itself, and how Jessie's emotional journey ends with that courtroom scene. And it's the whole I mean, the description of Joubert seeing her and then miming her being cuffed to the bed as that's her confirmation that it really was him. Like, just the description of that is so unsettling and just sends a chill down my spine, because we know in so few pages, we know so much about this character, like this villain, this despicable human being, this evil being, and the terrible things that he does. And it kind of puts it all together that he was there with Jesse, and just the thought of what he could have done and what he likely would have done is just so chilling, and something that kind of really stayed with me for a little while after reading this, or after listening to the audiobook. So overall, I mean, Gerald's Game I thought was really well done. I didn't really have many expectations for it, because it's one of those Stephen King books that I didn't know much about going into it. And I know that there is some connection with it to Dolores Claiborne, and I definitely want to read that soon, but right now I'm going through the Dead Zone. But yeah, I'll read that soon and give my thoughts on it in another episode of Tower Junkies. And speaking of this being Tower Junkies, I don't think there were any connections to the Dark Tower in Gerald's Game. None that I could find. And that makes sense. As far as where it ranks with other Stephen King books, I do keep a file or a note on my phone that's all of the King books that I've read, ranked by my enjoyment of it. It's a fluid list. It always changes. I kind of have Gerald's Game kind of somewhere in the middle, or maybe below middle. I have it just below Pet Sematary, which Pet Sematary really, really messed me up. But I have it above Carrie and Salem's Lot, which, pending rereads of those, I mean, that could all change. Like I said, it's a pretty fluid list, and constantly changing, depending on my mood and where I'm at when I'm reading or rereading the novels. Yeah, so that's my review of Gerald's Game. Of course, it is being adapted into a film for Netflix. Okay, it's going to come out on September 29th, 2017. I believe it's going to have a theatrical release, but it's also going to be released on Netflix. It stars Carla Gugino as Jesse Burlingame, and Bruce Greenwood as Gerald, which I thought was a good casting choice. Bruce Greenwood is awesome. Directed by Mike Flanagan, who he directed, I believe he wrote and directed Hush, which has gotten a lot of good feedback. I haven't seen it. He also made Ouija Origin of Evil, which I heard was pretty good. I'm a terrible fan of horror movies, because I haven't been keeping up to date with horror movies as of late, but I'm looking forward to Gerald's Game. I think that in terms of stories that King has written that can be adapted, I think it works best that Gerald's Game is kind of a smaller scale story, and it's kind of steeped more in psychological terror and kind of a more grounded scenario in a way. And I think that'll do well with it being adaptable. But as any Stephen King fan knows, the ratio of good adaptations to bad adaptations is pretty. It swings, and it's pretty clear. Like, there's most of the adaptations are pretty bad. So we'll see. I know that King is kind of going through an adaptation renaissance, so hopefully Gerald's Game is good. But I will be on here to review it. I think I'll have Tiny watch it too, and then he and I can be on the show and talk about our thoughts on Gerald's Game. Until then, thank you for listening. And again, shoot me an email at matt@obsessiveviewer.com, and go like the Facebook page at facebook.com/TowerJunkiesPod, and also follow me on Twitter at TowerJunkiesPod. Yeah, thank you so much for listening, and long days and pleasant nights. Thank you for listening to Tower Junkies, a Dark Tower podcast presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find more of our episodes at towerjunkiespod.com, and you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can find ways to do that at towerjunkiespod.com/donate, or become a patron for Obsessive Viewer at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer for recurring donations with different reward tiers. Every donation goes toward paying the fees to keep the podcast running and is greatly appreciated. Any and all feedback on the podcast is encouraged. You can contact us by emailing us at matt@obsessiveviewer.com, or by tweeting us at towerjunkiespod, or at obsessiveviewer and at obsessivetiny. You can also like us on Facebook at facebook.com/towerjunkiespod. For more podcast content from obsessiveviewer.com, check out Anthology, my solo side project podcast where I'm reviewing The Twilight Zone as a first-time viewer and exploring other classic and contemporary science fiction anthology television shows. You can find Anthology at anthologypod.com and anywhere podcasts are found. Finally, if you're philosophically curious, check out Tiny's side project podcast, The Secular Perspective, which explores the concepts of faith, religion, and existence from the perspective of secular hosts Chad and Amanda. You can find that at thesecularperspective.com and subscribe to the podcast on the app of your choice. Once again, thank you for listening to Tower Junkies, and we'll see you next time.